Picture this. The morning everything changed. The Dursleys didn't get one letter. They got two. You already know what happened with the first one. Letters started pouring into number 4 Privet Drive like the post office had lost its mind. Through the mail slot, under the door, down the chimney. Vernon Dursley, a man who prided himself on being completely, aggressively normal, absolutely lost it. He nailed the mail slot shut. He boarded up the windows. He drove his family to a shack on a rock in the middle of the ocean just to escape pieces of paper. But here's what nobody ever told you. The second letter had a different name on it. Not Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs. This one read, Mr. D. Dursley, the second bedroom. Vernon picked it up with shaking fingers. He read the name once, twice. His face went white. Then it went red. Then it went a color that doesn't have a name, somewhere between rage and terror, and the kind of shame that comes from realizing your whole life has been a lie. He didn't just burn that letter. He turned around and looked at his son, Dudley, 11 years old, pudgy and confused, standing in the hallway in his pajamas, wondering why his dad looked like he was about to explode. Freak, Vernon said. The word hit Dudley like a slap across the face. You're one of them. Dudley didn't understand. He just stood there, blinking. This was his dad, the man who had given him everything. Every birthday cake, every Christmas present, every extra helping at dinner. The man who had told him over and over that they were normal, and normal was the most important thing in the world to be. Now those same eyes, the ones that had always looked at Harry with pure hatred, were aimed directly at him. In the kitchen doorway, Petunia Dursley stood completely still. She had heard that word before. She had felt what it did to a person. She had watched it destroy her sister, not because Lily was weak, but because the people who were supposed to love her had aimed it at her like a weapon. And Petunia had told herself, all these years, that she was different, that she had chosen the right side, the normal side, the safe side. But now her husband was calling her son a freak, and something inside her cracked wide open. She thought about a letter she had written when she was 11, a desperate, embarrassing, hopeful letter to Albus Dumbledore, begging him to let her come to Hogwarts too, begging him to tell her she was special, that she had magic, that she wouldn't be left behind while Lily got to disappear into a world that glittered and shone and wanted her. He had written back, kindly but firmly. No, she had spent 30 years being angry about that letter, angry at Dumbledore, angry at magic, angry at Lily for getting what she couldn't have. She had taken that anger and she had built a life around it, a perfectly normal life, a deliberately small life, where magic didn't exist and nobody talked about it, and Harry Potter lived in a cupboard because looking at him hurt too much. And now here was her son, standing in the hallway being called the same thing she had spent her whole life running from. Not again. He is my son, Petunia said. Her voice came out louder than she expected, sharp, like something had snapped inside her, and she wasn't interested in pretending anymore. I won't let you do to him what I did to Lily. Vernon's response was immediate and brutal. Either they were freaks or they weren't his family. He gave them an ultimatum right there in the hallway of number 4, Privet Drive, the house they had shared for years, the house she had scrubbed and polished and made aggressively ordinary because ordinary felt safe. Get out, he said. Get out of my house. So they left, that same night. 2 trunks dragged down the front path. 3 people with no plan and nowhere to go. Petunia walked with one hand on Dudley's shoulder and the other on Harry's, and Harry flinched when she touched him, because in 11 years of living in her house, she had never once touched him gently. He looked up at her face, expecting to see the usual pinched expression, the barely contained irritation that had defined every interaction they'd ever had. What he saw instead was fear. Not fear of magic, not fear of weirdness or abnormality or whatever Vernon had always been so terrified of. Fear that she had already made every mistake that mattered. Fear that it was too late. Harry didn't know what to do with that. So he just kept walking. There is something about a train that forces honesty. Maybe it's the motion, the way the world keeps moving outside the window, whether you want it to or not, the way you can't walk away from a conversation because there's nowhere to walk to, The way the rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks fills the silence just enough that you notice the silence anyway. The Hogwarts Express smelled like chocolate and coal smoke, and the particular kind of excitement that belongs to people who don't yet know what they're walking into. Steam billowed across platform 9 3/4. Owls hooted from their cages, families clustered together, some crying, some laughing, some doing both at the same time. Red-haired children seemed to be everywhere. Harry Potter stood on the platform with a trolley, an owl, and absolutely no idea what he was doing. Dudley Dursley stood 3 feet behind him with 2 trunks, a wand he couldn't make work, and 11 years of memories that felt like stones in his pockets. They hadn't spoken much since leaving Privet Drive. There wasn't a script for this situation. There was no version of events where 2 people with their history simply shook hands and started fresh. Every time Dudley looked at Harry, he saw something he didn't want to see, which was himself. The version of himself he had been for years. The boy who had chased Harry through the neighborhood for sport. The boy who had eaten the food off Harry's plate and laughed about it. The boy who had gotten everything and still wanted more, just so Harry couldn't have it. And every time Harry looked at Dudley, he saw something he didn't want to see either. He saw the face of his tormentor wearing an expression he had never seen on it before. Uncertainty. They found a compartment near the middle of the train. They sat down on opposite sides. The window between them showed the platform slowly sliding away, then the outskirts of London, then the countryside opening up green and wide and endless. Neither of them spoke. 11 years of cruelty hung in the air between them like smoke, like something that had been burning for so long it had become part of the atmosphere. Harry thought about the cupboard, the locked door, the sound of Dudley's birthday parties drifting down from above while he sat in the dark. Dudley thought about his father's face. That word, the way it had felt to be on the receiving end of something he had watched Vernon aim at Harry 1,000 times without ever once wondering what it felt like. He knew now. The compartment door slid open. Draco Malfoy had the particular talent of walking into a room and immediately making everyone in it feel like they were doing something wrong just by existing. He was pale and pointed, and dressed in robes that probably cost more than the Dursleys' car, and he had 2 enormous boys flanking him who seemed to function primarily as furniture that occasionally breathed. He took one look at Harry and smiled the smile of someone who had been practicing being unpleasant since before they could walk. "So it's true," Malfoy said, stepping inside without being invited, because invitation was something that happened to other people. "Harry Potter is actually on the train." He said it the way you might say you'd found an interesting insect. Curious, faintly entertained, not particularly impressed. "They're saying you were raised by muggles," he continued, settling himself against the doorframe like he owned it. How dreadful. No proper upbringing. No knowledge of how things actually work. No idea who matters and who doesn't. He let that sit for a moment. Pity. Then his eyes slid sideways to Dudley. He took in the size of him, the muggle clothes, the expression on Dudley's face that suggested he was understanding about 40% of what was being said and was not particularly enjoying any of it. Malfoy's lip curled. "And who exactly is this?" he asked. "Your pet whale?" The 2 large boys behind him, Crabbe and Goyle, thought this was absolutely hilarious. They made sounds that roughly approximated laughter. Dudley's jaw tightened. Here is what you need to understand about Dudley Dursley at this particular moment. He had spent 11 years being the biggest, loudest, most feared person in his immediate world. He had never been on the receiving end of mockery from someone who genuinely didn't care about his size, his fists, or his father's ability to complain to people's parents. He didn't understand most of the words Malfoy was using. Mudblood, pure blood, the houses, the rules, the entire invisible architecture of a society he had never been told existed. But he understood bullies. He had been one his entire life. He knew the specific tone of voice, the way the words were designed not to inform but to diminish, the way Crabbe and Goyle laughed not because anything was funny, but because laughing was how you showed which side you were on, the way Malfoy held himself, like the world was arranged for his convenience and everyone else was just scenery. Dudley recognized it because he had done it every single day. To Harry, something shifted in his chest. It was uncomfortable and unwelcome, and he couldn't quite name it, but it sat there like a stone and refused to move. Malfoy kept going, because Malfoy always kept going. That was the thing about people like him. They had never once been stopped, so they had no reason to believe stopping was something that applied to them. You'll learn soon enough, Potter. There are families that matter in this world, and families that don't. There are people worth knowing and people worth ignoring. I can show you the difference. He extended his hand, smooth and practiced, like he'd done it 100 times in his head. Stick with me, and you'll be fine. Harry looked at the hand. He thought about Hagrid, who had shown up on a rock in the middle of the ocean and been the first person in Harry's entire life to treat him like he was worth something. He thought about the way Hagrid had said Malfoy's family's name, with a very particular kind of careful neutrality that said more than words. He thought about the instinct in his chest that was already telling him quietly and firmly that this outstretched hand was a trap. "I think I can tell the wrong sort for myself," Harry said. "Thanks." Malfoy's hand dropped. His expression did something complicated. It moved through surprise, to embarrassment, to the particular cold fury of someone who has never been publicly refused before and does not know what to do with the feeling. "You'll regret that," he said. His voice had gone flat and quiet, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted. He turned to leave. And then, almost as an afterthought, like he was tossing a piece of litter over his shoulder, he added, "Enjoy your mudblood cousin while you can." Dudley moved before he thought about it. His body made the decision independently of his brain. His brain was still processing the word, still turning it over, still trying to understand why it landed the way it did, like a slap, like something designed specifically to degrade. His body didn't wait for the analysis. His hand shot out, caught Malfoy by the collar, yanked him backward off his feet, and shoved him into the compartment wall hard enough that the window rattled in its frame. "Leave him alone." Dudley's voice came out low and steady, which surprised even him. He had expected it to shake. The compartment went absolutely silent. Malfoy's eyes had gone wide. For possibly the first time in his 11 years of existence, he was looking at someone and genuinely not knowing what was going to happen next. Crabbe and Goyle reached for their wands, slow and automatic, but then they stopped, because they were looking at Dudley properly for the first time, taking in the full picture. And the full picture was considerable. Dudley Dursley was 11 years old and already larger than most adults. He had spent years eating everything in sight and getting into neighborhood scraps for entertainment. He was not, in any technical sense, a threat they were equipped to handle. They hesitated. That hesitation was everything. "Let's go," Malfoy said. His voice shook slightly on the second word. Just slightly. Just enough. He pulled free of Dudley's grip, straightened his robes with sharp, deliberate movements that were supposed to look like dignity, and mostly just looked like someone recovering from a shock. "You'll pay for that, Muggle." He left. Crabbe and Goyle followed, pulling the compartment door shut behind them. The silence that came back was completely different from the silence that had been there before. That silence had been heavy with history, with everything unsaid between two cousins who had grown up on opposite sides of a door. This silence was something else. It was the silence of two people who had just been through something together and were trying to figure out what it meant. Harry stared at Dudley. He didn't trust it. That was the honest truth. 11 years of cruelty didn't evaporate because of one moment on a train. The body remembered things that the mind hadn't caught up with yet. Harry's body remembered locked doors and stolen food and the sound of Dudley's laughter while he cried. It was going to take more than one shove against a wall to undo all of that. But he couldn't pretend the shove hadn't happened. "Why did you do that?" he asked. Dudley was quiet for a moment. He looked at his own hands. Then, out the window, then at some middle distance that contained whatever answer he was looking for. "Didn't like how he talked to you," he said finally. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't a speech. It was 4 words delivered with a shrug, like Dudley himself wasn't entirely sure what had come over him and wasn't ready to examine it too closely. Harry didn't say anything, but something shifted, something small and careful and not yet ready to be named. A crack in a wall that had been standing for 11 years. The door slid open again, this time revealing a boy with red hair, freckles, and a smear of something on his nose that might have been dirt or might have been food. Ron Weasley looked at the compartment, took in Harry's expression and Dudley's clenched fists and the general atmosphere of something having recently happened, and said, with the masterful social instinct that would define him for the next 7 years, "Everything all right?" "Yeah," Harry said slowly, like he was testing the word. "I think so." Ron looked uncertain but sat down anyway, because Ron Weasley was the kind of person who sat down first and asked questions later. He had a question about Harry's scar within 30 seconds, and a story about his brother, and a ghoul before the first 10 minutes were up. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, the tension in the compartment loosened just enough to breathe. Dudley sat quietly and listened. He learned things about Hogwarts, about the houses, about Quidditch, which was apparently a sport played on broomsticks, which should have sounded insane but somehow didn't by this point in the day. He learned about Ron's family, about the Weasley twins, about Gryffindor, and what it meant to be sorted, and what the sorting hat actually did. He didn't say much, partly because he didn't know enough to contribute, and partly because something was still working itself out in his chest, that uncomfortable shifting thing that had started when Malfoy walked in and hadn't stopped since. The train climbed north. England unrolled itself outside the window, green fields giving way to hills, giving way to the wild, dark drama of the Scottish Highlands. The sky turned amber, then pink, then deep blue, then black, and absolutely stuffed with stars. More stars than Dudley had ever seen from the light-polluted suburban sprawl of Little Whinging. He pressed his face close to the glass. In the distance, just barely visible on the horizon, something glittered. A castle. Towers and turrets and 1,000 lit windows burning warm against the black sky, sitting on a cliff above a lake that reflected every light perfectly, so it looked like there were 2 castles, one above and one below, mirror images of each other reaching toward their own reflections. Dudley had never seen anything like it in his life. He had never felt anything like what he felt looking at it, which was something that started in his stomach and expanded into his chest and was embarrassingly close to wonder. Then a thought arrived, cold and quiet and completely unwelcome. What if I can't do this? His reflection stared back at him, pale and wide-eyed, and nothing like the confident, swaggering person he had been 3 days ago on Privet Drive. What if I don't belong? He whispered it because it was too big to say at full volume, and Harry, who was sitting 3 feet away and had heard every word, didn't answer because he was staring at the same castle, thinking the exact same thing. The sorting was chaos dressed up as ceremony. 1,000 candles floated in mid-air above 4 long tables, and the ceiling showed the real sky outside, which was doing something spectacular with clouds and moonlight. Hundreds of students turned to look as the first years filed in, and the collective gaze of several hundred people is a genuinely overwhelming experience when you are 11 years old and have never been anywhere near this important before. Harry went first. Alphabetically, the hat dropped over his eyes and went very quiet for a moment, and then it started whispering things that were not entirely comfortable to hear, about ambition and cunning and the kind of greatness that wore more than one face. Harry gripped the stool and thought, not Slytherin, not Slytherin, not Slytherin, with everything he had, and eventually the hat, apparently moved by his conviction, sent him to Gryffindor. The red table erupted. The Weasley twins were particularly enthusiastic. Then the names continued, one by one, until Dursley, Dudley. The whispers started immediately, not the curious, excited whispers that had followed Harry's name. These were different, confused, unsettled, the kind of whispers that happen when something appears that doesn't fit any available category. Is that a muggle? He's enormous. Why is he here? Did you see the clothes he's wearing? Dudley walked to the stool like someone approaching a doctor's appointment they'd been dreading for months. He sat down. The hat dropped over his head and plunged him into darkness. Then the hat started talking. It said things he hadn't expected. It didn't just sort people into houses based on what they were. It sorted them based on what they could become. And what it saw in Dudley Dursley was not, as he had feared, nothing. It saw stubbornness that could become loyalty. It saw the part of him that had grabbed Malfoy's collar on the train without stopping to calculate whether it was safe. It saw the capacity for a kind of faithfulness that didn't ask for recognition or reward, that simply showed up and stayed. The hat saw all of this, and it took its time, and the hall waited. Hufflepuff. The yellow table applauded. Politely. Correctly. Nothing more. Dudley trudged to his seat. He looked across the hall to the Gryffindor table, where Harry was sitting with Ron Weasley and already being enthusiastically adopted by the Weasley twins. Harry caught his eye for a moment. Then the next name was called, and everyone looked away. Different houses, different dormitories, different schedules, different friends, different lives running parallel in the same enormous castle. Hogwarts was big enough to swallow a person completely if they let it. The first week nearly destroyed him. Magic, as it turned out, did not care that you had received a letter saying you were a wizard. Magic did not automatically present itself just because you were technically supposed to have it. Magic required something from you, some opening, some belief, some combination of intention and motion and focus that Dudley could not find no matter how hard he reached for it. His wand felt like a stick he'd picked up in the park. It felt like nothing. It felt like holding a pen when you didn't know how to write, and everyone around you was writing novels. In Flitwick's class, they were supposed to levitate a feather. Dudley pointed his wand. He said the incantation. He tried to feel whatever it was he was supposed to feel. The feather did absolutely nothing. He tried again. The feather continued to do nothing. Around him, students were making feathers drift and bob and float gracefully upward, and some of them were looking at him sideways, and some of them were whispering. And by the fourth failed attempt, the whispers had coalesced into something recognizable. The Muggle's cousin. Dursley the Dud. Why is he even here? He stopped going to the Great Hall for meals. Too many eyes. Too many people watching him be the thing he had always been at home in reverse. At home, he had been the one with all the power, all the space, all the food, all the attention. Here he was the wrong kind of different in a place where different was normal, and somehow he had still managed to be the wrong kind. Harry found him in the library 3 nights in a row. The third night, Harry sat down across from him without asking permission and looked at the wand lying on the table between them and said quietly so the librarian wouldn't hear, "Show me the movement again." "What?" The swish and flick. "Show me what you've been doing." Dudley showed him. Harry watched carefully. Then he showed Dudley what the motion was supposed to look like. Slow and deliberate, breaking it down into components the way you'd teach someone a physical skill, rather than an abstract one, because that was how Harry had started to understand it himself, not as something mysterious and internal, but as something with moving parts that could be examined. They practiced until 2 in the morning. The librarian was long gone. The candles burned low. Swish and flick, over and over and over, until the motion stopped being thought about and started being felt. On the 19th try, Dudley's feather moved. It didn't float up gracefully like everyone else's. It didn't drift. It rose 3 inches off the table and hovered there, trembling, stubborn, like something that had decided to hold its ground against gravity by sheer refusal to accept the alternative. Dudley stared at it. He had never in his life felt anything like what he felt in that moment. Not birthday cakes, not Christmas presents, not the rush of chasing someone down the street and knowing they were afraid of him. This was something completely different. This was the feeling of something impossible becoming possible specifically because he had refused to stop. The feather hung in the air. "Your turn," Dudley said, and there was something different in his voice now, something that hadn't been there before. "Teach me something. I'll teach you something." Harry looked up. "Like what?" "How to throw a punch." Dudley set the wand down. "Magic won't save you from everything." Harry looked at him for a long moment. Then he smiled. It was the first time Dudley had ever seen Harry smile at him. Actually at him, not despite him, not in relief that he'd left the room. At him, like he was someone worth smiling at. "Deal," Harry said. They met every week after that, sometimes in the library, sometimes in an empty classroom, sometimes in a corridor so obscure that no prefect had walked it in living memory. Spells and boxing, wands and fists. Harry taught Dudley Lumos so he could stop being afraid of the dark, Wingardium Leviosa so he could stop dreading Flitwick's class, the basics of how to aim a spell when your hands were shaking. Dudley taught Harry how to stand properly, how to throw from the shoulder, how to take a hit without going down, how to hold yourself in a way that made people think twice before deciding you were a target. It was, objectively, a strange education. But somewhere between the library stacks and the bruised knuckles, between the failed spells and the successful ones, between the silences that were no longer heavy with old cruelty, but comfortable with something new, they stopped being cousins. They became brothers. Neither of them said it out loud. It was the kind of thing that didn't need saying. It just was, quietly and solidly and without ceremony, the way the most important things tend to happen. But someone had been watching. Severus Snape was not a man who wandered corridors by accident. Every step he took through Hogwarts was purposeful, deliberate, calculated. He moved through the castle like a shadow that had decided it preferred to do the haunting rather than the being haunted, and his presence in any given location generally meant he had chosen to be there. He had been watching the library for 3 weeks, not because he suspected rule-breaking, though rule-breaking was clearly occurring, because of something else. Something that nagged at him with the particular persistence of things you desperately want not to mean what they appear to mean. He stood in the shadows outside the library door and watched Dudley Dursley point a wand at a feather and fail, and fail, and fail, and then succeed. And he watched the expression on the boy's face in the moment of success. He had seen that expression before. He had seen it on a red-haired girl in a park in Cokeworth, the first time she had made a flower open without touching it. The absolute incandescent shock of discovering that the world was larger and stranger and more welcoming than anyone had told you it was. The joy of belonging to something you'd been told wasn't for you. Petunia's son, Lily's nephew, together in a library at 2 a.m. Snape stood very still in the shadows. His face revealed nothing. His hands at his sides trembled slightly. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people. It is worse than ordinary loneliness. Ordinary loneliness is at least honest about what it is. It sits with you quietly and doesn't pretend to be anything else. But the loneliness of being in a crowded room where every face has turned against you, where you can hear your name in every whispered conversation and none of it is kind, where you walk down corridors and the crowd parts not because they respect you, but because they don't want to be near you, that kind of loneliness is a different animal entirely. It has teeth. Harry Potter learned this in his 4th year. The Triwizard Tournament arrived at Hogwarts the way disasters often do, dressed up as something exciting. 3 schools, 3 champions, tasks of dangerous magical skill designed to test courage and ability and the particular kind of stubbornness that keeps people moving forward when every sensible instinct is screaming at them to stop. There was a goblet. There was fire. There were names submitted on pieces of parchment by students who were old enough and brave enough and ambitious enough to want to try. Harry's name came out of the goblet. He hadn't put it in. He was 14 years old and had not submitted his name, and had no idea how it had happened, and had approximately 0 desire to compete in a tournament where previous champions had ended up dead. None of this mattered. His name had come out of the goblet, which meant he was a champion, which meant he had to compete, which meant that to the rest of Hogwarts he had either cheated his way in by some method nobody could quite identify, or he was lying about not having entered, which was somehow worse. The badges appeared within days. Potter stinks. Bright, cheerful, eye-catching. Draco Malfoy had apparently been busy. They spread through the student population like something contagious, pinned to robes and jumpers and school bags, a small daily declaration of where everyone stood. The Slytherins wore them first, which was expected. Then some of the Ravenclaws, which stung a little more. Then students from other houses, miscellaneous faces Harry had never done anything to, wearing his name as a punchline because it cost them nothing and felt like belonging to something. Then the Hufflepuffs. This was the one that landed differently, because Cedric Diggory was the Hufflepuff champion, the real champion, the one who had properly entered and properly been selected and properly deserved his shot at glory. And Hufflepuff had waited a long time for a champion. They were not, as a house, accustomed to being celebrated. They were accustomed to being overlooked, to being the house people mentioned when they were listing the other 3, to being defined primarily by the absence of the qualities that made the other houses famous. No particular cunning, no particular daring, no particular brilliance. Just loyalty and hard work and the willingness to show up, which turned out to be less cinematically impressive than everyone else's defining traits. So when their champion appeared, they held on to him with everything they had. And when Harry's name came out of the goblet alongside Cedric's, they heard it as a theft, an intrusion, someone reaching into their moment and taking something that didn't belong to him. Dudley watched his housemates pin the badges to their robes. "Come on, Dud, it's just a laugh." He looked at the badge in his hand, small and green and mean in the specific way that small mean things can be. He turned it over once. Then he put it in his pocket and didn't pin it to anything. He started watching Harry in the corridors. What he saw made the stone in his chest heavier. Harry walked with his head down and his shoulders pulled in, the way you walked when you had learned through long experience that making yourself smaller reduced the number of things that could hit you. Dudley recognized that walk. He had caused that walk. He had spent years being one of the reasons Harry moved through the world like someone expecting impact. Seeing it here, in the middle of a place that was supposed to be different, in a world where Harry was supposedly special and celebrated and important, was something Dudley hadn't prepared for. The hall outside the kitchens was quiet on a Tuesday evening. The smell of whatever the house elves were preparing drifted through the stone walls. Harry was walking back from somewhere, alone, hands in his pockets, doing the small shoulders walk that Dudley had been watching for weeks. 4 Hufflepuffs stepped out from around a corner, not Dudley's close friends, not people he'd shared much more than a common room with, but his housemates, his year, people he knew by name and face, and the particular way they laughed at things. They had their wands out. They were wearing the badges. "Cheater," one of them said. His voice had the forced lightness of someone who has decided this is just a bit of fun and is working hard not to examine that decision too closely. "You stole Cedric's glory." Harry's hand moved toward his wand. Stopped. There were 4 of them and one of him, and the corridor was empty. "Bet you used dark magic to get your name in," another one said, stepping closer. "Let's see how the famous Harry Potter handles real Hufflepuffs." They were working themselves up. Dudley had seen this process before from the inside. The way a group of people could move each other towards something none of them would have done alone, each one feeding off the other's willingness, the momentum of it becoming its own justification. He had run that process himself. Many times, with Harry as the target, he stepped around the corner. All 6 feet of him, fists at his sides, jaw set. "Walk away," he said. The 4 Hufflepuffs turned. Whatever they had been expecting, it was not this. It was not one of their own housemates planting himself between them and their target like a wall that had decided to have opinions. "Or what, Dursley? You'll fail to curse us?" There was laughter in it. Nervous laughter, the kind that happens when a situation has become uncertain. And laughter is the fastest way to pretend otherwise. Dudley smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who had grown up in a house where the solution to problems was frequently physical and had consequently become very good at physical solutions. "I won't need a curse," he said. The first punch dropped the ringleader cleanly. He hadn't been expecting it, which was his mistake. You should always expect it from someone who is smiling like that. The second punch caught his friend in the stomach, which removed him from the equation efficiently. The third punch never landed because the remaining 2 had already decided that the mathematics of this situation did not work in their favor and were in the process of removing themselves at speed. Dudley stood where the danger had been, solid and still, as if daring it to come back. Harry stared at him. The corridor was quiet again. The 2 students on the floor were making the kinds of sounds that people make when they are reassessing their life choices. Professor Sprout arrived approximately 90 seconds later, which suggested she had been somewhere nearby and had heard the sounds of reassessment happening. She looked at the students on the floor, she looked at Dudley, she looked at Harry, she looked at Dudley again. "Detention, Mr. Dursley," she said. 1 month. "Yes, Professor," Dudley said. He didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't offer context or justification, or the entirely reasonable defense that 4 people with wands drawn against one unarmed person constituted a situation that required intervention. Sprout turned to leave. Then she paused at the corridor entrance and looked back over her shoulder. "Why?" she asked, not accusatory, genuinely curious. The question of someone trying to understand a thing that didn't fit the pattern she'd expected. Dudley met her eyes. "He's my brother," he said. Professor Sprout looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her expression that wasn't quite readable, some combination of surprise and recognition, and something older and softer that didn't have a simple name. Then she walked away without responding. Harry waited until her footsteps had faded completely. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," Dudley said. "You've got a month of detentions." "I know." Harry looked at him. "Thank you." Dudley shrugged. It was the shrug of someone who was not yet comfortable receiving gratitude for things he considered straightforward. He picked up Harry's bag from where it had fallen against the wall and handed it back to him, and they walked back toward the castle together. And neither of them said anything else, and it was the most comfortable silence they had ever shared. That night, alone in his dormitory after his housemates had fallen asleep, Dudley lay on his back and stared at the ceiling and thought about Lily Potter. He had never met her. She was just a name, a photograph, a face that appeared in Harry's eyes sometimes when Harry didn't think anyone was watching. She was the person his mother had lost and never gotten over, losing the ghost that had haunted number 4 Privet Drive for Harry's entire life without anyone ever being willing to actually say her name out loud. She had died for Harry. That was the story. She had stood between her son and something terrible, and she had stayed standing even when staying standing meant dying. And something about that act had created a protection that had lasted for 13 years. Dudley had always found this story confusing. Why would you do that? What could possibly be worth that? He thought he was starting to understand. He pulled out a piece of parchment, dipped a quill in ink, wrote slowly and carefully, because parchment and quills were still not entirely natural to him. "Dear Mum, I think I understand now why Aunt Lily died. She had someone worth dying for." He stopped. Read it back. Continued. "I think I do too." He stared at the letter for a long time. The candle on his bedside table burned steadily. Outside the dormitory window, the grounds of Hogwarts stretched away into the dark, the lake silver in the moonlight, the forest a black line at the edge of everything. He thought about sending it, thought about what his mother would say in response, whether she would understand what he was trying to say, or whether she would hear it as something frightening, evidence that her son was in danger, proof that she had made a mistake bringing him here. He wasn't ready for the answer. He folded the letter carefully, tucked it into the back of his Transfiguration textbook behind the index. Then he blew out the candle and lay in the dark and listened to his housemates breathe, and tried to figure out when exactly Hogwarts had stopped feeling like a foreign country and started feeling like home. The tournament continued. The tasks were extraordinary and terrifying in equal measure. Dragons, merpeople, a maze that seemed to have developed a personality and not a pleasant one. Cedric Diggory moved through them with grace and skill and the steady confidence of someone who had been preparing for exactly this. Harry moved through them with considerably less grace and considerably more near-death experiences, which seemed to be his natural mode of operation. Dudley watched from the stands like everyone else, but differently from everyone else. Where the crowd gasped and roared and cheered and occasionally booed, Dudley sat with his hands pressed flat on his knees and his eyes tracking Harry's movements with the focused attention of someone who was calculating risks rather than experiencing entertainment. He had started learning more magic. Seriously, deliberately, beyond the basics he needed to pass his classes. He asked the Hufflepuff prefects for help. He visited the library voluntarily, which was not something he had ever done in his previous life. He practiced in the evenings until his wand stopped feeling like a dead stick and started feeling like something that occasionally listened to him. He was never going to be the most talented wizard in any room. He had accepted this. The magic in him was real, but it was not spectacular. It was not the kind that made professors go quiet with impressed surprise. It was not the kind that got written about in letters home. It was steady and stubborn, and it worked most of the time if he was patient enough. He decided that steady and stubborn was enough, because Harry was going to keep walking into dangerous situations. This was not a theory. This was an established pattern of behavior, with considerable evidence behind it. And when those situations arrived, Dudley intended to be useful. He wrote the letter to his mother 3 more times that year. Each time he got a little further before folding it away. The third version filled an entire page, both sides, and said things he hadn't planned to say about fear and belonging, and what it felt like to discover that the person you had treated worst your whole life was the person you would most want next to you if something went wrong. He never sent any of them. He kept them all, tucked into various textbooks, a paper record of someone becoming someone different, slowly and imperfectly, and without any guarantee that the process was going to lead anywhere worth going. But it was leading somewhere. He could feel it. The third task was a night of fire and screaming, and something going catastrophically wrong in a maze that had been supposed to be controlled and wasn't. Harry disappeared into the maze with Cedric Diggory, and came back with Cedric's body and a terror in his eyes that Dudley had never seen in them before. Not fear of normal things, not the flinching watchfulness of someone who had grown up expecting to be hurt. Something older and colder and worse. The look of someone who had stood in a graveyard and watched someone die and come back from it not entirely whole. The school erupted into chaos. Teachers rushed. Students screamed. Dumbledore moved through the crowd with the focused urgency of someone who had been waiting for something like this and was not surprised but was afraid. Dudley pushed through the crowd until he could see Harry. He didn't try to get to him. There were too many adults in the way. Too many people who had authority and purpose and reasons to be exactly where they were. He just found a position where he could see Harry's face and stayed there. Harry was shaking. He was wrapped in a blanket someone had thrown around his shoulders, and he was shaking and not looking at anyone and not saying anything, just staring at the ground in front of him with the specific blankness of someone whose brain had temporarily refused to process any more input. Dudley stayed where he was until he was sure Harry knew he was there. Harry looked up once, found him in the crowd, held eye contact for just a moment. Dudley nodded. "I see you, I'm here." Harry looked back down. That was all. That was enough. Some things didn't need words because words would have made them smaller. The tournament was over. Cedric Diggory was dead. Something had changed in the world, shifted in a way that most people hadn't felt yet, but would. Something fundamental and irreversible, the way the air changes before a storm that's been building for a very long time. Dudley went back to his dormitory and retrieved the letter from behind the index of his Transfiguration textbook and read it again. "I think I have someone worth dying for." He put it back, blew out the candle, lay in the dark. Outside, the Scottish Highlands held the castle in their ancient arms, and the stars did what stars always do, which is shine without caring what is happening underneath them. Dudley stared at the ceiling and made himself a quiet promise. Nothing complicated, no speeches, no dramatic declarations, just "not on my watch." Summer had a particular quality in little whinging. It was the quality of sameness, of days that repeated themselves with minor variations, warm and suburban and aggressively uneventful. The kind of neighborhood where the most dramatic thing that happened on any given Tuesday was someone parking slightly over the line or a hedge growing in a direction that the next-door neighbor found personally offensive. The streets were clean, the gardens were maintained. Everything was exactly as it appeared to be, which was the whole point, which was what everyone on Privet Drive had silently agreed to value above all other things. Harry and Dudley had spent the summer in a kind of careful coexistence. Petunia had found them a small flat in the next town over after leaving Vernon, cramped and slightly damp and nothing like the immaculate suburban fortress she had maintained for 15 years, but hers, genuinely hers, in a way that number 4 had never quite managed to be. She had scrubbed it until it gleamed. She had put curtains up. She had made it into something that functioned like a home, which was different from something that looked like one. Harry and Dudley shared the second bedroom. This was not ideal. This was, in fact, the kind of arrangement that would have been completely unthinkable 2 years earlier, the domestic equivalent of mixing matter and antimatter. But 2 years had passed, and they were different people now, or at least they were people in the process of becoming different, which is not the same thing, but is arguably more interesting. They had established a system. Harry took the left side of the room. Dudley took the right. Dudley was not allowed to touch Harry's things. Harry was not allowed to complain about Dudley's snoring. These terms had been negotiated wordlessly over the course of 3 days through a series of pointed looks and strategic placement of objects. And they held. Some evenings they talked, not about important things mostly, about Hogwarts, about teachers they found unbearable, about the particular madness of magical sport, about Ron's latest letter, about whether Dudley was ever going to get the hang of transfiguration, which remained stubbornly resistant to his best efforts. The conversations had the slightly careful quality of people who were aware that they were building something and didn't want to put too much weight on it before it was finished. Some evenings they didn't talk at all, and that was fine too. Petunia fed them both. This was the most visible thing, the most concrete daily evidence that something had fundamentally changed. She cooked enough for 2 and served it in portions that were equal, and didn't make a production of it either way. Harry had spent 11 years watching food be allocated according to a hierarchy in which he ranked below the household pets. Watching Petunia put the same amount on both plates was not a dramatic gesture. It was not accompanied by speeches or apologies. It was just a thing she did, quietly, every day, and it meant more than any speech could have. She and Harry were still not easy together. There was too much history for easy. But they were trying, in the stumbling, uncertain way of people who know they've done damage and are not sure the damage is repairable but feel obligated to try anyway. Small conversations, the occasional question about Hogwarts that she clearly found both fascinating and painful to ask. A gradual, incremental thawing that neither of them acknowledged directly, because acknowledging it would have required talking about why it had been frozen in the first place, and neither of them was ready for that conversation yet. August arrived. The heat settled over the town like something with weight. On a Thursday evening, with nothing particular happening and no reason to be outside, except that the flat was small and warm and occasionally claustrophobic, Harry and Dudley ended up walking through the neighborhood. Not together intentionally, just in the same direction, at the same time, with the same vague idea about finding somewhere that had a breeze. They ended up in the underpass. The temperature dropped without warning. Not the gradual cooling of evening settling in, sudden, total. The kind of cold that arrives with intention, that reaches into the air and removes something from it. Not just heat, but something less definable, something closer to hope. Dudley felt it before he understood it. His chest tightened, his vision blurred slightly at the edges. And then the memories started, which was the part that nobody ever warned you about adequately. The part that made Dementors so much worse than any physical threat, because a physical threat could only hurt your body. But this reached into the part of you where you kept everything you had ever done wrong and dragged it out into the light. Every meal he had stolen from Harry's plate, every time he had laughed while Harry cried, every time he had led his friends in chasing Harry through the neighborhood because it was a game, because it was fun, because it had never once occurred to him to wonder what it felt like from the other side. His father's voice, freak, worthless, freak, but also, terribly, his own voice saying the same things, saying them easily, saying them without cost, without consequence, without ever stopping to ask whether they were true or what they did to the person they were aimed at. He heard all of it at once. He had known, in an abstract way, that what he had done to Harry was wrong. This knowing had been developing slowly, since the train, since the library, since the corridor outside the kitchens. It had been growing in him like something that needed time and light before it could become fully itself. He had known it wrongly intellectually, distantly, with the comfortable remove of someone acknowledging a fact that hasn't yet been made completely real. The Dementor made it real. It stripped away every layer of comfort and distance and rationalization and held the truth up directly in front of him without apology or gentleness or any of the softening agents that usually mediated between a person and the worst things they had done. This is what you are. This is what you did. Look at it. Look at all of it. Dudley looked. Harry had his wand out. The Dementors, 2 of them, had materialized from the darkness of the underpass with the particular inevitability of things that had been heading toward this moment for a long time. Harry was already trying to manage both of them, turning between them, his wand hand steady, but his face showing the strain of it, the cold reaching into him too, pulling at his own particular collection of worst moments. One Dementor oriented toward Harry drew closer. Harry was struggling. Dudley could see it. The cold was winning. The Patronus charm required a happy memory, required the ability to hold something warm and real in the center of your mind, while everything in your environment was working to convince you that warmth was a thing that had never existed and would never exist, and the cold was all there was, and all there had ever been. Dudley's wand hand shook. He tried to find the incantation. He knew it. He had practiced it, not well, not reliably, but he knew the shape of it. Expecto. The word was there. The next part of it kept dissolving before he could hold it. He tried to find a happy memory. This was the other requirement, the one that people talked about less because it sounded simple and wasn't. You needed something real, something that could hold its shape under pressure, something the cold couldn't get into and hollow out. He reached for the obvious things: Christmas mornings, birthday cakes, the particular satisfaction of getting everything he wanted and more. The cold dissolved them instantly, not because they weren't real memories, but because they didn't have the right weight to them. They were real, but they were thin. Pleasure without connection. Having without belonging. They melted in the grip of the Dementor, like ice sculptures in a warm room, impressive looking, but with no structural integrity. The Dementor was almost touching Harry now. Dudley didn't think. He moved. It was not graceful. It was not magical. It was a large 15-year-old boy, throwing himself physically between a Dementor and his cousin, with absolutely no plan beyond interposition, using the same instinct that had grabbed Malfoy's collar on the train, the same deep pre-rational certainty that some things were simply not allowed to happen on his watch, regardless of the personal cost. The cold hit him like a truck. He screamed, and in the center of the screaming, in the place where the cold was at its absolute worst, something happened. A memory arrived that he hadn't gone looking for. Harry, in the library, third night in a row, patient and tired, and still there, still showing up, still choosing to teach someone who had given him every possible reason to walk away and keep walking. The look on Harry's face when the feather rose 3 inches, not triumph, not the satisfaction of being proven right, but something gentler than that, something that looked like relief, like he'd been hoping Dudley could do it, and was glad to be proved right. Harry believing in him. That was it. That was the memory with enough weight to hold its shape. Not birthday cakes, not Christmas presents, not anything Vernon had ever given him. A library, 2 in the morning, a feather rising 3 inches, and Harry Potter looking at him like he was someone worth investing in. Something pulsed out from Dudley's chest. Later, when he tried to describe it, he would fail. He had never found language adequate to the sensation. It was not a Patronus. He was not capable of a Patronus. Not then, not with his level of magical development, not under those conditions. But it was something, warm and heavy and purposeful, like the air itself deciding that this particular spot was not available to despair, like something fundamental in the fabric of the moment pushing back against the cold with everything it had. A flash of warm light, pale, formless, nothing like the blazing silver animal that erupted from Harry's wand moments later, but real, genuinely verifiably real. The Dementor recoiled. Just for a second, just enough, Harry raised his wand, found his happy memory, James and Lily and Sirius and Remus running through a forest, younger than Harry was now, the whole world ahead of them. Expecto Patronum, prongs, erupted from the tip of his wand, like something that had been waiting to exist, silver and blazing and magnificent. An enormous stag made of light and memory and the stubbornness of the living. And it charged down the underpass, and the Dementors fled before it like shadows before morning. Silence. The warmth came back gradually. The air returned to itself. The memories retreated to wherever memories went when they weren't being weaponized. Dudley slid down the wall of the underpass and sat on the ground and shook. Harry was at his side immediately, hand on his shoulder, solid and present, and real in the way that only people you care about can be real, with a weight to them that strangers don't have. "What the hell was that?" Harry said. His voice was unsteady. "What did you do?" "I don't know," Dudley said honestly. He looked at his hands. They were still trembling. "I felt it, though. The magic." He paused. It was there. He looked up. His eyes found Harry's. It was actually there. Harry held his gaze. Something passed between them that didn't have a name and didn't need one. Then Harry sat down on the ground next to him, which was objectively undignified and completely appropriate, and they sat together in the underpass while the warmth finished coming back and the ordinary summer night reassembled itself around them. "You're a complete idiot," Harry said finally. "Probably," Dudley agreed. "You could have been killed. So could you." Harry opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "That's not the point." "It's exactly the point," Dudley said. Harry stared at the ground. Then, very quietly, "Thank you." "Don't mention it," Dudley said. And then, because he was Dudley and couldn't quite let a moment be entirely serious, literally, don't mention it to anyone. It was deeply embarrassing. Harry laughed. It was a slightly hysterical laugh, the kind that happens when your body has been through something it wasn't designed for and is attempting to release the pressure through whatever valve is available. But it was real. They sat in the underpass for another 10 minutes before either of them felt ready to stand up. The owl arrived within the hour. 2 owls, actually, one for Harry, one for Dudley. Identical Ministry of Magic seals. Identical former language. Identical barely concealed institutional fury at the existence of underage magic performed outside of school boundaries. Expulsion pending a hearing. Petunia read both letters at the kitchen table with the expression of someone watching a car crash that they had technically seen coming, but had hoped might somehow swerve at the last moment. Then she folded them very precisely, set them on the table, and said nothing for almost a full minute. "Right," she said finally. "Mum," Dudley started. "No," she said, "not angry, just certain. The certainty of someone who had made a decision so large and so final that there was no room left for uncertainty anywhere near it. I'm going with you, both of you. Whatever hearing this is, I'm going." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She looked at him. Then she looked at Harry. Her expression did something complicated. "I should have done many things I didn't have to do. I'm done not doing them." She got up and put the kettle on. Because Petunia Evans Dursley's response to crisis was always to put the kettle on, and none of them said anything else that night. Dumbledore's office smelled like old books, and something sweet that Dudley couldn't identify, something that reminded him vaguely of his grandmother's house before she died. The room was full of things that moved when you weren't looking at them directly. Portraits and instruments and small silver objects that spun and clicked and seemed to be measuring something important. Dumbledore sat behind his desk and looked exactly like what he was, which was an enormously old man who had seen more things than he was going to tell you about and had arrived at some kind of peace with that. And the peace made him either wise or frightening, depending on how you looked at it. Harry sat to the left, Dudley sat to the right. Petunia sat in the middle with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight in the way of someone who had made a decision and was sticking with it regardless of how uncomfortable the chair was. "You wanted the truth," Dumbledore said. His voice was gentle, not soft. There was a difference. Soft implied that the thing being said was comfortable. Gentle implied that it wasn't, but that he was going to say it carefully anyway. "Now you'll have it." Petunia's hands tightened in her lap. "I wrote to you," she said. The words came out smaller than she'd intended, pressed thin by the weight of however many years she'd been not saying them. "When I was 11, I found out about Hogwarts, about what Lily was, about what the school was. I wrote to you and I begged you to let me come too." Harry went very still beside her. Dudley looked at his mother. He had never heard this story. In 15 years of living with her, through all the years when magic was a forbidden word in their house, a thing that didn't exist and wasn't discussed, and was treated with the particular intense denial reserved for things that frighten you too much to acknowledge, she had never once mentioned a letter. "You refused," she continued. Her voice cracked on the word, but she kept going. "Kindly. You were kind about it, I'll give you that. You explained that magic wasn't something that could be learned by those without it, that I didn't have it, that I never would, that Hogwarts wasn't a place for me. Tears were running down her face. She didn't move to wipe them, she just let them run. Lily got everything. The letters, the wand, the world. She got to disappear into something extraordinary, and I got to stay behind and be ordinary and watch her shine and pretend I was happy for her, when every time I looked at her, I felt something I'm ashamed of. She stopped, breathed. Jealousy, pure jealousy, the kind that poisons everything it touches. She looked at Harry, really looked at him, not past him, not at some point over his shoulder where she could pretend she was engaging without actually meeting his eyes. At him. When she died, I hated her for leaving me. And when they brought you to my door, I hated you because you had her eyes and her face, and every time I looked at you, I saw everything I had lost and everything I had never had, and it was easier to make it your fault than to admit that it was mine. The office was very quiet. The portraits on the walls were all pretending to be asleep, which was the portrait equivalent of giving people privacy. Dudley's chair scraped back. Not dramatically, not in anger, just the motion of someone who couldn't stay still anymore. "You made me hate him too," he said. His voice was level. "You and Dad, you built the whole thing and you put it in my hands, and I used it because I didn't know any better. You turned me into him." "I know," Petunia said. "Dudley, I know. Do you know what it felt like to be him?" He wasn't shouting. That was somehow worse than shouting. "Do you have any idea what his life was like in our house? What we did to him? What I did? I can't undo it." Her voice broke apart completely on the last word. "I cannot undo any of it. I know that. I know exactly what I did, and I know it can't be undone. And I am asking you, both of you, to let me try to be something different. I don't deserve it. I'm not asking because I deserve it." The room absorbed this. Harry had not moved. He was sitting with his hands very still on his knees, and his face doing something that was clearly requiring significant effort to keep controlled, cycling through things too fast to be identified. Years of locked doors and cold meals, and the cupboard under the stairs, and the specific quality of being made to feel like your existence was an imposition on people who had done you a favor by tolerating it. "You could have told me," he said finally. His voice was quiet. "About Lily. About why. About any of it. I was a child, but I wasn't stupid. I would have understood. Would you?" Petunia met his eyes. "At 8 years old? At 10? Could you have forgiven me, knowing what I had done to you deliberately, out of jealousy and bitterness and cowardice? Could you really have done that?" Harry didn't answer. He genuinely didn't know. He had spent a lot of time imagining different versions of his childhood. Versions where someone had been kind, where someone had told him the truth, where the world had made sense earlier. He had never imagined a version where the kindness came attached to a confession that made it both more understandable and in some ways more devastating. Dumbledore spoke into the silence, carefully, with the gentleness that was not softness. "The blood protection I placed on Harry was never fueled by love, Petunia." She looked at him. "It was fueled by your guilt." The words settled into the room like stones into deep water, slowly and with finality. "Guilt is powerful magic," Dumbledore continued. "Underestimated usually, not as celebrated as love. But it has its own particular force, the force of obligation, of the thing owed, of the wound that won't close until something is done about it. Your guilt for what happened to your sister, for the choices you made, for the way you treated her son. That guilt has protected Harry for 14 years. He paused. But guilt fades. It fades as it is replaced by other things, by rationalizations, by distance, by the slow erosion of feeling that comes with time. The protection is weakening." His blue eyes, behind their half-moon spectacles, looked older than usual, older and more tired and carrying something heavy. "Voldemort will sense it soon." Dudley grabbed Harry's arm. The motion was completely involuntary. The same instinct that had sent him into the underpass, the same deep refusal to let certain things happen. "What does that mean?" he said. He already suspected. He wanted to be wrong. Harry already knew. He looked at Dumbledore, at his aunt, at his cousin's hand on his arm. He thought about the graveyard, about the terror in his chest that had been living there since 4th year, quiet most of the time but never gone, the knowledge that something was coming, and the only question was when. "It means the war is coming to Privet Drive," he said. Petunia went the colour of old paper. Dudley's grip on Harry's arm tightened. Outside the windows of Dumbledore's office, Hogwarts stretched away in every direction, towers and courtyards, and centuries of accumulated magic, and it had never looked more beautiful or more fragile than it did in that particular moment, when they all understood for the first time how large the thing was that was moving toward them. The hearing, as it turned out, was almost beside the point. Dumbledore attended it personally, and it lasted 20 minutes, and both Harry and Dudley were cleared of all charges and permitted to return to school, which was never really in doubt, but was still a relief to have confirmed in writing. Petunia drove them to King's Cross in September in a second-hand car that had opinions about hills. She pulled up to the entrance and sat with the engine running for a moment before either of them got out. "Be careful," she said. She said it to both of them equally. Dudley leaned over and hugged her, briefly, fiercely, in the way of someone who had learned that brevity was not the same as insufficiency. Harry paused with his hand on the door. Then he turned back and looked at his aunt and said something that cost him something to say. "I don't hate you." Petunia looked at him. Her eyes were very bright. "I know that's not the same as forgiving me," she said. "No," Harry said. "It's not, but it's what I've got right now." She nodded. That was enough. It had to be enough. They got out of the car and went through the barrier and onto the platform, and the Hogwarts Express was waiting for them, scarlet and steaming. And the world was getting darker in ways that had nothing to do with the season, and they were 15 years old and heading back toward the center of it. Dudley found the letters in his trunk that night, all 4 of them, tucked into various textbooks where he had left them over the years. He read them in order. The progression was visible, the thing he had been trying to say becoming clearer and more honest with each attempt. He started a 5th one. "Dear Mum, I think I understand now what Aunt Lily did and why. I think I understand what you did too, or tried to do, and why you got it wrong. I'm not sure I can explain the difference yet between understanding something and being okay with it, but I'm working on it. He's my brother. I know that sounds strange. I know you know it too. I think we're both going to need to be ready for what's coming. I think ready means different things for different people. For me, it means being the person standing between him and whatever comes next. I'm not scared of that. I want you to know that. Whatever it costs. I'm not scared." He stopped. Read it back. Folded it. Put it with the others. Then he turned out the light and lay in the dark of the Hufflepuff dormitory and listened to the castle settle around him, the sound of something very old and very patient. And he thought about guilt and love, and the particular magic of choosing to stay when leaving would have been easier. And he fell asleep before he could think of anything else. Outside, the Scottish sky held more stars than little Whinging had ever shown him. He had stopped being surprised by that. There is a particular quality to the silence of a place that used to be safe. It is not ordinary silence. Ordinary silence is neutral. It sits in a room without agenda, without history, without the specific weight of comparison. But the silence of a place that was once full of noise and warmth and the particular chaos of hundreds of people living closely together and learning things they hadn't known yesterday, when that place goes quiet under the wrong kind of authority, the silence has texture. It has memory. It presses against you with everything it used to be and isn't anymore. Hogwarts in Harry's 7th year was that kind of silent. The castle was the same stones, the same towers, the same staircases that moved according to their own logic, and portraits that gossiped, and ghosts that drifted through walls with the casual ease of things that had stopped being surprised by anything centuries ago. The Great Hall still had its enchanted ceiling. The library still had its restricted section. The grounds still rolled away toward the lake and the forest and the mountains beyond, unchanged and indifferent to human difficulty in the way that landscape tends to be. But the people who moved through it now moved differently, carefully, with the particular economical stillness of people who had learned that being noticed had costs. The Carrows had arrived with Snape. Alecto and Amicus Carrow were not, technically speaking, teachers in any meaningful sense of the word. They had the titles, they taught the classes, But what they were doing in those classrooms was not education. It was something that wore education's clothing while being its precise opposite, the systematic replacement of knowledge and curiosity and the capacity for independent thought with fear and compliance, and the very particular kind of cruelty that flourishes when it has institutional backing. Muggle studies, under Alecto, had become an exercise in dehumanization. Dark arts, under Amicus, had become practice in performing it. Students who refused were punished. Students who objected were made examples of. The lesson was simple and consistent, and delivered every day. This is the order of things now. This is who matters and who doesn't. Learn where you stand. Dudley learned where he stood on the first day. He stood exactly where he had always stood, between the people with power and the people without it. But this time he was on the inside of the institution rather than the outside, which meant his options were different, and he intended to use them. It started small. It always starts small. A first-year Muggleborn named Alice, who couldn't stop shaking in the corridor outside the Carrows' classroom. Dudley had found her there between lessons, back against the wall, arms wrapped around herself, making herself as small as possible in the way of someone who had learned very recently that smallness was a form of protection. He had sat down next to her on the floor, right there in the corridor, which was not a dignified thing to do, and he didn't care even slightly. "What's your name?" "Alice." "I'm Dudley, third-year Hufflepuff. If anyone gives you trouble, you find me or you find any of the older Hufflepuffs, and you tell us. Do you understand?" She had looked at him with the enormous eyes of someone who wasn't sure whether to trust this, and had decided to anyway because the alternative was worse. "Why would you help me?" The honest answer was complicated, and referenced a library and a feather and a cousin he hadn't seen in months and a version of himself he was trying very hard not to be anymore. The practical answer was simpler. "Because someone should," he said. "And I'm here." He helped her find her next class. He made sure she knew which corridors to avoid and which teachers could be trusted and which prefects had become something other than what prefects were supposed to be. He introduced her to the older Hufflepuffs who were still themselves, still oriented by the values that had put them in yellow rather than any other color. Loyalty and fairness and the stubborn refusal to look away from someone who needed help. That was the beginning. Within 2 weeks it had grown. Not because Dudley had recruited anyone, or made speeches, or proposed any kind of formal structure, just because word moved through the lower years the way water moves, finding the paths of least resistance, and the word was simply, "Dursley will help." He was 17, and built like a wall, and completely unafraid of the Carrows in the specific way of someone who had grown up with Vernon Dursley as a father figure, and had consequently recalibrated their baseline for what counted as threatening. The Carrows were cruel and powerful and institutional, but they were not, at their core, anything Dudley hadn't navigated before. He knew how authority that had lost its moral compass operated because he had watched it up close for years, and had, to his lasting shame, participated in it. He knew its weaknesses. It relied on everyone accepting its framing. It relied on the target believing they deserved what was happening to them. It relied on bystanders looking away because looking away was easier and safer and the path of least resistance. Remove those conditions and the whole thing became considerably less stable. So Dudley removed them where he could. The Hufflepuff common room was in the basement, near the kitchens, accessible through a corridor that smelled permanently of good things cooking. It had always been the warmest common room in the castle, physically and otherwise, full of comfortable furniture and plants, and the kind of low-level cheerful noise that happened when people were fundamentally okay with each other. Under ordinary circumstances, it was a pleasant place to spend an evening. Under current circumstances, it had become something else. Dudley had reorganized the furniture. He wouldn't have described it as reorganizing. He would have said he just moved some chairs around. But the result was a series of small, semi-enclosed spaces around the edges of the room, each one large enough for 3 or 4 people to have a conversation that couldn't easily be overheard from the center. The house elves who supplied the kitchen had been, through a series of careful and respectful conversations that Dudley had conducted at odd hours, persuaded to occasionally leave extra food in a specific location near the entrance to the common room. Nobody had asked him to do any of this. He just did it because it needed doing. The students who ended up in those corner spaces were not always Hufflepuffs. This was technically against the rules. Students from other houses were not supposed to be in the Hufflepuff common room without invitation. Dudley's position on this rule was that rules existed in a specific context, and when the context changed sufficiently, the rules required re-examination. He would not have said it that elegantly. He would have said, "The rules are there so people are safe, and right now the rules aren't making anyone safe, so I'm going to do what actually makes people safe." Muggleborns who had been denied access to their textbooks. Students who had been given detentions that were, in practice, torture. First and second years who were terrified and had nowhere else to go. They found their way to the corner spaces in the Hufflepuff common room, and Dudley fed them and listened to them and made sure they knew that what was being done to them was wrong, and that the people doing it were wrong, and that the world had not always been like this and would not always be like this. "You'll get yourself killed," Ernie Macmillan told him. Ernie was a good person and a practical one, and his concern was genuine. "The Carrows know something is happening. They're watching the common room. Let them watch," Dudley said. "That's not a strategy, Dudley." "I know." Dudley was quiet for a moment. "But if I stop, where do they go? Alice and the others, where do they go?" Ernie didn't have an answer for that. "Better me than them," Dudley said. It was not a performance. It was not heroics. It was the simple arithmetic of someone who had looked at a situation and calculated who was best positioned to absorb the cost and had arrived at an answer he was at peace with. Ernie looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Right. What do you need me to do?" That was how the Hufflepuff Resistance got its second member. It never had a name. Names created evidence, and evidence created vulnerability. It never had a hierarchy beyond the informal authority that Dudley held simply by being the person who had started it and maintained it and taken the hits for it when the hits came. It never had a manifesto or a formal set of rules or anything that could be found and used against them. It just had people who showed up. Hannah Abbott, who had lost her mother in the war and channeled her grief into a fierce protective fury that expressed itself as organizational brilliance. Zachariah Smith, who was not naturally selfless and knew it and showed up anyway because some situations are large enough to override your natural self. Susan Bones, steady and practical and possessed of a family history that gave her a very clear-eyed view of what happened when good people decided that the situation wasn't their problem. And Neville Longbottom, who was not a Hufflepuff, but had apparently decided that houses were a suggestion rather than a constraint, and who turned up one evening with a bruised face and a level of controlled fury that Dudley recognized because he felt it himself, and who said simply, "I want to help." Dudley looked at him. "You're Gryffindor." "Yes." "You're not supposed to be here." "No." Neville's expression didn't change. "Are you going to do something about that?" Dudley moved aside. "Sit down. There's food." That was how the Hufflepuff Resistance gained its most effective ally, and the operation quietly doubled in capability within a week because Neville had connections throughout the castle that complemented Dudley's in ways that seemed almost designed. The Gryffindors' willingness for direct confrontation combining with the Hufflepuffs' willingness to do the invisible work that didn't get celebrated, but without which nothing functioned. They found passages. Hogwarts had more passages than were on any map, more than even the Marauders map had documented. Narrow stone corridors behind tapestries and through walls that seemed solid until you knew exactly where and how to press. They learned them all, memorized routes that could move people from one end of the castle to the other without once passing through a corridor that the Carrows monitored. They communicated through a system that Hannah devised, notes written in a code that looked like ordinary homework and was meaningless to anyone who didn't know the key, passed through a chain of trusted hands. They maintained a mental map of where the Carrows were at any given time of day, updated constantly through a relay of observers, the same kind of distributed awareness that a forest maintains through the way animals respond to predators, information flowing without central organization because the network itself was the organization. They never attacked anyone. This was a conscious choice. The temptation was real. Amicus Carrow was doing things to students that made Dudley's fists ache with the desire to respond directly. But direct confrontation would have ended everything. They didn't have the numbers or the power for direct confrontation. What they had was persistence and invisibility, and the willingness to keep doing the small things that kept people alive and sane while they waited for the larger situation to resolve itself. "How long do we keep doing this?" Hannah asked one night. They were in the corner space, long after curfew, speaking in voices too low to carry. "Until it's over," Dudley said. "And when is it over?" He thought about Harry. Somewhere out there in a world that had become hostile and dangerous, moving through it with Ron and Hermione, doing something that Dudley didn't have the full picture of, but that he understood was necessary and was taking everything they had. "When Harry finishes what he's doing," Dudley said. "And then we finish it here." Hannah was quiet for a moment. "You believe in him." "Especially then," Dudley said. "If I had to know all the details to believe in something, I wouldn't believe in much." Hannah looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Then she said, "Your first-year charms professor thought you were going to fail out before Christmas." "She was probably right," Dudley said. "Things change." Snape watched. This was what Snape did. He had been watching for years, decades, an entire lifetime of careful observation and catalogued information, and the patient accumulation of understanding in service of purposes that nobody in the castle fully comprehended. He moved through Hogwarts like a shadow with intent, present at the edges of things, seeing what he wasn't supposed to see, filing it away in that extraordinary interior archive where everything was indexed and cross-referenced and available for retrieval when required. He watched the Hufflepuff common room. He watched the passages. He watched Dudley Dursley move through the castle with the steady purposefulness of someone who had found something worth being purposeful about. He did not intervene. This required explanation, because Snape intervening in student activities was, under ordinary circumstances, one of the most reliable constants in the Hogwarts universe. He had built an entire teaching career on the particular satisfaction of intervention at precisely the worst possible moment for the person being intervened upon. He did not intervene in this. He told himself various things about why, that it was strategically useful to have a functioning underground in the castle when the time came, that disrupting it would be visible and raise questions he didn't want to answer, that the Carrows already suspected something and disrupting it might accelerate their investigation rather than prevent it. These were all true. They were not the whole truth. The whole truth lived somewhere in the part of Severus Snape that he had spent 30 years refusing to look at directly, the part that was not the spy or the professor or the Death Eater or any of the other roles he had accumulated in service of the long game he was playing, the part that was just a person, the part that had grown up poor and friendless and had found one person in the world who had looked at him and seen something worth knowing, and had spent his entire subsequent life paying the price of losing her. He watched Petunia's son protect Lily's nephew. He watched the boy who had been raised to be Vernon Dursley's instrument choose every single day to be something else. He thought about choices, about the ones that defined you and the ones that redeemed you, and the question of whether redemption was even a coherent concept or just a story people told themselves to make the past bearable. He didn't have an answer. He had stopped expecting to find one. But he left the Hufflepuff resistance alone, and once, in the dead of winter, he left a bag of food outside the entrance to the Hufflepuff common room that was far more than the house elves would typically provide, without any note or identification, and walked away before anyone could see him. Nobody commented on it, nobody asked where it had come from. Some things worked better when they remained unexplained. Spring arrived in the way that spring arrives at Hogwarts, suddenly and completely, the grounds erupting into green almost overnight, the lake losing its winter opacity, the air changing from the specific cold that had settled over everything since September into something that smelled like possibility. And Harry came back. Dudley heard it through the network before he saw it, the word moving through the castle with the speed of something people had been waiting a long time to say. "Potter's here. Harry Potter is in the castle." He made his way to the room of requirement with the focused efficiency of someone who had spent a year learning to move through a hostile environment without being noticed. The room was full when he arrived, fuller than he had expected. The DA reassembled and expanded, faces he recognized and faces he didn't, all oriented toward the same center point. Harry. He looked terrible. That was the first thing. Thin and exhausted, and carrying something invisible that had weight to it, the kind of weight that accumulated in the bones rather than the muscles. The weight of a year of running and hiding and losing people and not being able to stop for any of it. His hair was worse than usual. His robes had clearly had a difficult several months. His eyes were the same. That was the important thing. Whatever the year had taken from him, it hadn't taken that. The eyes were still Harry's, still recognizable, still containing the same quality that Dudley had first noticed in a library at 2 a.m, when a feather rose 3 inches and Harry looked at him like he was someone worth investing in. They found each other across the room. Dudley pushed through toward him. Harry pushed through toward him. They met somewhere in the middle and stood face to face for a moment, taking stock, doing the rapid assessment that people who care about each other do after long separation, checking for damage, cataloguing what was different, reassuring themselves that the essential thing was still there. Harry gripped his shoulder hard, the grip of someone who had been alone for a very long time and was finding solid ground. "You're alive," Harry said. It came out more emotional than he'd probably intended. "Obviously," Dudley said. "I told you. Hufflepuffs are stubborn. I heard what you were doing. Neville told me. Neville talks too much. Dudley." Harry's grip tightened. "What you did. The people you protected. That was—" "Don't," Dudley said. Not harshly, just firmly. "Don't make a speech about it. It needed doing, and I did it, and that's the end of it." Harry looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, in the way of someone who understood and was going to respect the boundary even if they disagreed with it. "Don't die for me," Harry said. His voice was quiet and serious, and carrying something behind it, the specific weight of someone who had watched too many people make that choice already. Dudley smiled. The library smile, the alley smile, the smile that belonged to every moment they had survived together. It carried all of those moments in it, folded in like layers. "I'm a Hufflepuff, mate," he said. "I'll die for everyone." Harry didn't laugh. He looked at Dudley with an expression that was several things at once: love and fear and the particular anguish of someone who believes you and wishes they didn't. Then the castle shook. Something enormous and magical and violent was happening outside, and the time for standing still and looking at each other was over. "Stay alive," Harry said. "You too," Dudley said. They went in different directions. The battle was not what stories make it. Stories make battles sequential. First this happened, then this, then this. A clear order, a progression that can be followed, meaning that accumulates in a recognizable direction. Real battles are not sequential. They are simultaneous and chaotic and full of information arriving faster than it can be processed, and the sounds are wrong, louder and more various than any description prepares you for. And the light is wrong. Flashes of color from spells that turn darkness into brief, terrible daylight. And the smells are wrong, smoke and dust and things that don't have names. And your body is operating on something other than conscious decision, because conscious decision takes too long, and you move and you react, and you survive or you don't. Dudley moved through it. Expelliarmus, a Death Eater's wand, flew. Stupefy, another crumpled. Protego, a curse deflected, scraping along the shield charm and dissipating into the stone wall. His wand work was not elegant. It had never been elegant. It was functional and stubborn and occasionally surprising, which was its own form of advantage because people facing him expected incompetence based on his reputation in first year and frequently received something else entirely. When magic failed, which it did several times, his fists didn't. A Death Eater, who had cornered a group of third years in an alcove off the main corridor, learned this in a very direct and unambiguous way. Dudley's right hook connected with precise force, and the man dropped, and Seamus Finnegan, who had been providing covering fire from behind a suit of armor, stared with an expression caught between horror and delight. "Bloody hell, Dursley." Less talking, Dudley said. More moving. They moved. The castle was coming apart around them in ways that felt both impossible and inevitable. Walls that had stood for 1,000 years were opening up under the force of curses. Suits of armor were marching with purpose in directions they'd never moved before. Ghosts were doing things Dudley hadn't known ghosts could do. The paintings were shouting intelligence to anyone who could hear them, running between their frames with the frantic urgency of a communication network that had been waiting for the chance to be useful in a crisis. Dudley was bleeding from somewhere on his left side. He had noticed this in the way you notice things in the middle of something larger. Intellectually, filed away for later attention. It wasn't stopping him. He would deal with it when there was time to deal with it. He had lost track of Harry. This was the thing that existed under everything else. A constant low-level awareness that Harry was somewhere in this chaos, and that the chaos contained things specifically trying to end Harry, and Dudley couldn't see him and couldn't track him and had to trust that Harry was managing. He managed his piece of it. The 3rd years he moved to safety behind the tapestry on the 3rd floor, the passage to a room that the Death Eaters hadn't found. 2 Hufflepuff 2nd years with a stunned prefect between them, Dudley taking them through a route that avoided the worst of the fighting. Neville's voice from somewhere above, coordinating something with the focused authority of someone who had been waiting a long time to be exactly who he was in exactly this moment. Then he came back through the Great Hall, and he saw it, a flash of purple, not aimed at him, aimed at Harry's back. Harry, who was 20 feet away, and turned away from it and completely unaware. Harry, who had just survived everything. A year in the wilderness, a battle that had taken people he loved, the impossible weight of being the person that everything depended on. The flash of purple moving toward the back of Harry's robes with the specific velocity of something that would not miss. Dudley heard his father's voice, just for a heartbeat, just long enough to feel the full weight of every choice that had brought him to this moment. The choice Petunia had made at the fire with the 2 letters, the choice he had made on the train, the choice in the library, the choice in the underpass, the choice in the corridor outside the kitchens, all of it forming a chain, link by link, each one leading inevitably here. Then he stepped forward anyway. He didn't think. He didn't calculate. He didn't weigh outcomes, or consider alternatives, or perform any of the rational operations that humans theoretically use to make decisions. His body simply moved with the absolute conviction of something that had been decided a long time ago, in a library at 2 in the morning, when a feather rose 3 inches, and Harry Potter looked at him like he was worth something. His shoulder caught Harry's chest, shoved him sideways, hard. The curse meant for Harry's heart caught Dudley instead. He hit the ground. He didn't get up. Harry screamed his name. The sound of it was something that people who heard it would carry for a long time afterward. The specific quality of it stripped of everything except the core of what it was. Not a call, not even a warning. Just pure, unmediated horror. He dropped to his knees beside Dudley. His wand was still in his hand, and he had no idea what to do with it. There was no spell for this. There was no incantation that addressed the specific reality of his brother lying on the floor of the Great Hall, not moving. No. Dudley. He grabbed his shoulder, shook him. Got no response. Around them, the battle continued. It had no interest in their particular tragedy. It was too large and too busy with its own momentum to pause for any individual piece of it. Curses flew. People shouted. The castle shook. Harry understood something in that moment that he had not fully understood before. This was what his mother had done. Not just technically, not just as an act that could be described and categorized and cited as precedent. This specific thing. The choice to be in the way. The choice to absorb something that was meant for someone else. The choice made from love so complete that it precluded calculation. He looked up. Voldemort stood across the hall. He was smiling. The smile of someone who had found the exact right blade and had used it precisely. Sentiment, the Dark Lord said. His voice carried through the battle with the ease of something that had learnt to make itself heard regardless of noise. Always your weakness, Potter. Harry rose. His wand hand was shaking. Not from fear, from something that was the opposite of fear, in the way that certain things are the opposite of other things. Not by being absent, but by being transformed. The same energy redirected. Dudley's blood was on his robes. Dark and real and devastating, and also, in some way he couldn't fully articulate, the most powerful thing he had ever carried. The duel that followed shook the castle to its foundations. Elder wand against Holly, the most powerful wand ever made against the wand that had chosen Harry Potter at 11 years old in Ollivander's shop, and had stayed chosen through everything that followed. Dragons and graveyards and the Department of Mysteries and the forest and all of it. Power against something that wasn't power exactly, but was its own kind of force. the force of a person who had been loved enough to be worth dying for, and knew it. The spells met in the air. Avada Kedavra, Expelliarmus, and when Voldemort's own killing curse rebounded, redirected by the connection between the wands and the choice Harry had made in the forest and everything that had led to it, Voldemort fell. The battle ended, not all at once. These things don't end all at once. There is always a period of confused continuation, smaller pockets of fighting that haven't received the news yet, the momentum of violence carrying itself forward past the point where its cause has been removed. But it ended, gradually and then completely, like the last of a fire going out. Harry didn't celebrate. He didn't stand there with his arms raised, or accept congratulations, or do any of the things that the narrative logic of the situation seemed to call for. He ran back to Dudley, still on the floor, still not moving. The wound from the curse carved into his chest in a way that made Harry's stomach clench with something cold and absolute. He dropped to his knees again, put his hands on Dudley's face, his brother's face, broad and familiar and completely still. Please. His voice had nothing left in it. It was just the word, stripped bare. You don't get to leave me. Not now. Not after everything. Not like this. I am not doing this without you. Do you understand me? You do not get to leave. He was crying. He hadn't noticed when that had started. The great hall was quieting around him, the sounds of battle giving way to the sounds of aftermath, which were in their own way worse. Healers arriving, voices calling names, the particular sound of people finding out things they had been afraid to find out. Please, Harry said again. Quieter. Almost nothing. Silence. Then, a sound, wet and rough and enormously, devastatingly welcome. A cough. Dudley's chest moved. Slowly, painfully, but moved. His eyes opened, not all the way, just enough. Just a crack looking up at the ceiling of the great hall and then sideways at Harry's face and then, with visible effort, focusing. Told you, he said. His voice was barely there, scraped thin but present, absolutely unmistakably present. Hufflepuffs are stubborn. Harry made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob and didn't particularly resolve into either one. He pulled Dudley into his arms, careful of the wound, careful of everything, and held on with the specific grip of someone who had nearly lost something irreplaceable and was not quite ready to believe they hadn't. Around them, slowly, the sun was rising. Not metaphorically, actually. The enchanted ceiling of the great hall, which had been showing nothing but dark and smoke and terrible weather, cleared, and the light of an actual May morning came through it, golden and real and indifferent to what had just happened in the way that mornings tend to be, reliable and recurring and available to everyone equally, the dead and the living and everyone in between. Hogwarts held them. Madame Pomfrey worked on Dudley for 3 hours in the makeshift hospital wing that the great hall had become. The tables had been moved and the wounded lay in rows, and the healers moved between them with the focused efficiency of people who were not going to be defeated by the scale of the task in front of them. The curse had gone deep. It had done things that were going to take time to fully undo and would leave marks that wouldn't fully disappear. Madame Pomfrey said this with the particular directness of someone who had been patching up Hogwarts students for decades and had decided very early on that honesty served them better than comfort. He'll live, she said. He'll carry it. But he'll live. Harry sat in the chair next to Dudley's bed and didn't move from it for 6 hours. Ron and Hermione came and went. Friends came and went. Teachers came and went. The world outside the castle was doing the enormous complicated work of understanding what had happened and what it meant and what came next, all the machinery of aftermath grinding into motion. Harry sat in the chair and held his brother's hand, and didn't participate in any of it. Petunia arrived at noon. She came with the Order members who had been keeping her safe, a small woman in a coat that was slightly too big for her, moving through the great hall with the careful tread of someone who was not yet sure what she was going to find. She saw Dudley first, alive, bandaged, breathing with the slightly laboured quality of someone whose breathing had recently been a question rather than a certainty. She crossed the room and collapsed against him, and held on with both arms and didn't say anything for a long time. Dudley, who was technically still supposed to be resting, held her back. When she finally straightened, She turned to Harry. He was standing now. He had stood up when she came in, automatic and uncertain, not sure what was going to happen next, carrying all the old history in his body, even when his mind had moved past it. She looked at him. Everything she was in her face in that moment. All the complexity of it, the jealousy and the grief and the guilt and the 30 years of wrong choices and the year of trying to do something different and the specific terror of the last several hours, not knowing whether her son was alive. She reached for him slowly, giving him every opportunity to step back. He didn't step back. Her arms went around him. His went around her. Stiffly at first, with the awkwardness of people whose bodies hadn't learned this yet. Then less stiffly, "Thank you," she said. Her voice was completely broken. For saving him. For saving us. Harry had his face against her shoulder. He was 15 years too late to cry about a cupboard under the stairs, but apparently his body had decided now was the time. "He saved me first," he said. Petunia held him tighter. Dudley, from the bed, watched his mother hold his brother, and the stone that had been sitting in his chest since the train in first year, the uncomfortable shifting thing that had no name for a long time, and then had several names, and then resolved into something simple and solid, finally settled into its permanent place. Not gone. Never gone. You didn't undo what had been done. You didn't unknow what you'd learned about yourself and what you'd been capable of and what it had cost other people, but settled, present, bearable. He closed his eyes. Outside the windows of the great hall, the May morning was doing what May mornings do, being golden and unreasonably beautiful and full of the specific insistence of things that are alive. He let it happen.